12 people were brutally killed, and 17 were injured at the hands of one perpetrator. From 1996 to 2000, Huang Yan became a territory of fear and terror due to a series of horrifying crimes. It all began on the night of February 1st, 1996, at a pharmaceutical factory located not in a major industrial area, but at the foot of a mountain. Late in the evening, after 8 o'clock, factory worker Xiao Liu left the building to head to a nearby women's restroom. She had no idea that someone was watching her from the darkness. Xiao Liu was a young woman with striking looks and a slender figure. In the shadows, a suspicious figure armed with a sharp knife quietly followed her. A few minutes later, another worker, Xiao Wan, also emerged, heading to the restroom. As Xiao Liu and Xiao Wan entered the facility, the dark figure suddenly burst in and began swinging the knife, stabbing both women in the buttocks. Xiao Liu was the first to be stabbed and fell to the floor, screaming in pain. Xiao Wan barely had time to react before she felt a sharp pain in her buttocks. As she touched her wound, she realized that her clothes were soaked in blood. Xiao Wan was so shocked that she lost consciousness. The unknown dark figure did not attempt to rape them or make any threats. Instead, it swiftly fled the restroom, disappearing without a trace. The entire attack lasted less than 30 seconds, and the assailant did not utter a single word. When the police arrived at the scene, Xiao Liu described the attacker as short and thin, but she could not recall anything else about him. The only clue found in the restroom was a bloody imprint left by men's rubber slippers. From this imprint, the police estimated that the attacker was about 150 centimeters tall, and that the footwear was commonly worn by local residents. The perpetrator acted with remarkable skill, expertly wielding the knife. This puzzled the police, as such knife crimes typically occur with the intent of robbery, rape, or revenge. Yet something felt off in this case. Both victims, Xiao Liu and Xiao Wan, were young women around 20 years old. Just when the police were at a complete standstill, lacking any leads or motives for revenge, another attack occurred. 20 days after the first incident, on February 22nd, another young and attractive woman fell victim to an assault. She was walking down a dark street when the unknown assailant suddenly stabbed her in the buttocks with a sharp knife. As bystanders rushed to her aid, the woman lay on the ground moaning in pain. The attacker had struck from behind and quickly vanished, leaving her unable to remember his appearance. Then, on March 4th, March 22nd, and March 24th, 3 more women fell victim to similar attacks, also sustaining knife wounds to their buttocks. The perpetrator targeted women walking alone on dark streets and even dared to strike right at the door of their homes. On March 24th, Huang Yan was opening her front door when the assailant suddenly stabbed her. She screamed and her family rushed outside, but the attacker had already vanished. The police were perplexed. The criminal was becoming increasingly brazen, and the number of attacks was rising. He struck not only in dark alleyways, but also right in front of his victims' homes, leaving no traces or clues behind. The 5 assaults that occurred in quick succession sent the local community into a state of panic. People were shocked that the attacker seemed to be selecting beautiful women, targeting them exclusively in the buttocks. Women feared to go out in the evenings without male accompaniment, and fear became an inseparable part of their daily lives. Even at the factory, where employees often worked late shifts, men began to arm themselves with metal pipes and sticks to escort women home. The police and local residents organized joint patrols to enhance street security. This heightened vigilance paid off. From late March to May, no similar attacks occurred. People and police began to relax, believing the threat had passed. However, on the evening of May 25th, a new attack took place. Yuan Jing's wife, Mrs. Zhang, was home alone as her husband was on a business trip. After the previous incidents, she had been cautious about going out at night and went to bed early. The community believed that the perpetrator only attacked on the streets, making homes seem like safe havens. However, around 2 o'clock in the morning, Zhang suddenly woke up from a sharp pain in her leg. As she awoke, she initially thought it was a nightmare. But when she opened her eyes, she saw a dark silhouette at the foot of her bed. A stranger was wielding a sharp knife. Terrified, she screamed. In response, the assailant quickly rushed toward her and stabbed her twice in the buttocks. Zhang was convinced she was about to be killed and began pleading for her life. The assailant calmly backed away toward the door and said, "Don't scream. If you scream, I will come back and kill you." He then vanished, leaving her bleeding. Zhang sustained 3 wounds, 1 in her thigh and 2 in her buttocks. All the stabs were very deep. She was the only one who heard the assailant's voice and noted that he had a local accent. Just 30 minutes after this attack, another incident occurred in the same village. This time, the perpetrator broke into the home of another woman named Se. He stabbed her twice, aiming not at her buttocks or thigh like before, but at her genitals. Se was urgently taken to the hospital, but the injuries were so severe that a complex reconstructive surgery was required. However, the hospital in Yuan lacked the necessary resources for such a procedure, so the victim had to be sent to a larger hospital in another city. 2 weeks later, another horrifying attack occurred. The perpetrator continued his rampage, and on June 12th, he broke into the home of a woman living alone and systematically attacked everyone inside. 3 women fell victim to him, all sustaining knife wounds to their genitals. 2 of the victims suffered such severe injuries that doctors claimed they would never be able to have children. After the assailant attacked 5 people, Yuan plunged back into panic, and people began to fear staying at home. The perpetrator acted stealthily, and none of the victims could provide a clear description of his appearance. 5 days later, on the night of June 15th, he struck again, this time attacking a family, a mother and her 2 daughters. He stabbed the mother in the abdomen and both girls in their genitals. The 2 victims were terrified but managed to provide the police with details about the attack. They said, "He entered the house without hesitation. Threatening us with a knife, he first attacked our mother and then targeted us. We screamed, but he didn't say a word." In just 4 months, there had been 13 attacks on women, with the assailant consistently targeting their most vulnerable areas. The police concluded that this was not merely the work of a thug, but someone with perverse tendencies. The horrifying events plunged the entire UN community into fear and anxiety. The residents found themselves in a state of panic once again. The police and local self-defense forces canceled vacations and began round-the-clock patrols, meticulously checking every suspicious individual. Women no longer dared to walk alone at night, and many single women were forced to move in with relatives or friends, as living alone had become too dangerous. The intensified police measures and heightened vigilance among the population yielded results. For 3 months, no new incidents occurred. However, the UN police did not believe that all these attacks were the work of a single perpetrator. The frequency of the attacks was too high, and investigators suspected that multiple assailants might be involved. This misjudgment in the investigation had severe consequences. After 3 months without incidents, people began to relax, and the police eased their vigilance. Many women, forced to live alone due to financial difficulties, returned to their previous lives. However, the long silence was shattered by a new and even more horrifying crime. On the morning of September 27, 1996, at 10 o'clock, a resident of the village of Tenxiatun, Mrs. Zhang, discovered something dreadful at her neighbor's house. Mrs. Zhang noticed that the neighbor's dog was barking furiously, which was quite unusual. A few days earlier, Mrs. Gu had been home alone. She was known in the village for her beauty. Her fair skin and expressive eyes had made her a renowned beauty among the locals. Gu usually rose early in the morning to feed the dog, but on this day, it was already 10 o'clock, and the dog had yet to be fed. Assuming that the dog was barking out of hunger, Zhang approached Gu's house and knocked on the gate. To her surprise, the gate opened by itself. When Zhang entered the yard, she saw the tied-up dog barking wildly toward the house. This was strange, as the dog was usually calm and rarely made such noises. Sensing something was wrong, Zhang approached the front door and gently pushed it open. What she saw shocked her. Mrs. Gu lay on the floor in a pool of blood. Her throat had been slit, and blood soaked the blanket and the floor. Judging by the fact that the blood had already started to congeal, Gu had been dead for several hours. Zhang noticed that Gu's body was unclothed. Her dress had been cut off with a knife. In horror, she looked at the body and saw that Gu's abdomen had been slashed open with a sharp blade. Gu's intestines had spilled out onto the floor. Zhang had never seen anything so horrifying in her life, and shocked by the sight, she fainted right at the threshold. When Zhang came to after some time and looked at the body again, she made an even more horrifying discovery. Gu's breasts and genitals had been brutally severed. The shock caused Zhang to faint once more. Only after the neighbors helped her regain consciousness did she, trembling, begin to scream and plead for help. The brutality of the criminal clearly indicated that this was no ordinary murder. The city of Huang and local authorities were put on high alert. It was now evident that a single individual was behind all these killings, and his methods were becoming increasingly horrifying and calculated. The perpetrator was clearly not foolish. He meticulously planned each attack, choosing moments when he could quickly escape, and always knew how to avoid capture. His crimes took mere seconds or minutes, after which he vanished without a trace. He selected attack locations where there were no streetlights, or where the lights in nearby homes were turned off. The criminal targeted dark, unlit houses, and although he did not wear a mask, none of the victims could make out his features. After a series of horrific attacks in Huang, the perpetrator suddenly ceased his activities, and for a year, there were no new incidents. Over time, people began to forget what had happened, and life in Liaoxian gradually returned to normal. However, the criminal did not disappear. He simply lay low, understanding that the investigation had intensified security measures. A year and a half had passed since the last attack, and on April 2, 1918, the criminal struck again, this time in the village of Dashin, located in the Yongsan district. The local Chung family became his new target. The daughter-in-law of the Cheng family was known for her beauty, as was her younger sister, who lived in the same village. The perpetrator noticed that the house was dark and quiet, leading him to believe that the couple was asleep. He silently opened the door and slipped inside, but he was met with an unexpected surprise. The couple had just had an argument and couldn't fall asleep. Suddenly, they heard someone enter the house. The husband, hearing the footsteps, shouted, "Who's there? What do you want?" The perpetrator knew that Cheng's husband was tall and strong, and not wanting to take any risks, he quickly fled. Realizing that Cheng's husband was too physically imposing to confront, the criminal escaped swiftly. The Cheng couple hurriedly got dressed and rushed outside, but the assailant had already vanished. Remembering the events from a year prior, they immediately went to the police to file a report. However, they were completely unaware that an even more horrifying tragedy was unfolding at that very moment. The criminal had not fled at all. While the police were en route to the village, he had already infiltrated the home of his second target, Cheng's younger sister. He climbed in through a window and attacked the sleeping husband of the sister, stabbing him in the neck. The blade severed an artery, and within seconds the man was dead, writhing in agony. This brief struggle awakened his wife, Cheng's sister. Realizing in horror what was happening, she rushed out of the house in her nightgown to call for help. The village was small and quiet, and her screams quickly awakened the neighbors. However, the perpetrator was not in a hurry. He caught up with the fleeing woman and in one swift motion slashed her throat. After that, without any rush, he mounted his motorcycle and disappeared. As the perpetrator sped away from the village on his motorcycle, he spotted the headlights of a police car in the distance. He instantly swerved and turned onto a side road, evading capture at high speed. Minutes later, the police arrived in the village, but it was too late. The criminal had vanished. For the first time, he had faced the police directly, but without a hint of anxiety, he managed to slip away, which only reinforced his sense of superiority. However, his rampage was far from over. Just 2 hours after the attack on Cheng's younger sister, the perpetrator struck again. This time, he crossed into the village of Xianyanzin and encountered a local woman named Wang, who was walking down a dark street. Wang was on her way to seek a doctor due to a sudden illness in her family. The attacker spotted her and, without hesitation, jumped off his motorcycle, stabbing her twice with a knife, intent on killing her. Fortunately, Wang was not just a helpless woman. In her youth, she had served in the militia and was in excellent physical shape. Despite the knife wounds, she fought back with all her might and began to scream for help. Her cries alerted nearby neighbors, who rushed out of their homes. Hearing this, the assailant hastily jumped back onto his motorcycle and fled once again, leaving his attempt unfinished. When people discovered Wang, she was severely injured, but her life was no longer in danger. The perpetrator, however, continued his assaults, targeting women living alone, attacking couples, and even killing people randomly. In a single day, he committed 3 attacks, killing 2 individuals and seriously injuring another. These tragic events caused public outrage in Yunnan and Jilin province, where authorities demanded that the police immediately capture the criminal. It was emphasized that if law enforcement failed in their duties, there would be strict penalties for each new victim. The police of Yuan and specialized task forces were mobilized everywhere, initiating joint patrols. Reinforcements also arrived from the neighboring city of Tonghua. Around 200 police officers were deployed to hunt down the criminal, and street patrols were significantly intensified. However, the perpetrator suddenly ceased his activities in Yuan and fled to another location. A month later, on the night of May 31st, 1918, a new murder occurred in the village of Hesu in Liaoning Province, not far from Yuan. The victim was a local resident, Zhang Qibai. The perpetrator broke into the house where his neighbor's fiancée, Ho, was sleeping and delivered a fatal knife wound to her neck. He then savagely mutilated her body, slicing open her abdomen and severing her breasts. When the homeowner, Zhang Qibai, noticed something was amiss, he attempted to pursue the intruder, but the attacker vanished before he could be apprehended. Just 20 days later, in the early morning of June 11th, the criminal struck again. He entered the home of the Cho family in the village of Xinbin, where a sleeping woman was fatally stabbed. Her screams awakened the neighbors, who rushed to help, but despite their attempts to save her, the woman died in the hospital from severe blood loss. 10 days later, on the night of June 21st, the criminal broke into the Wang family's home in the village of Xinbin. Wang's husband had been working all night and exhausted was sleeping soundly while the perpetrator sat in their yard for an hour, waiting for the right moment. When the dog began barking, Wang stepped outside to investigate. The attacker, frightened, jumped over the fence and fled. Wang assumed it was just an ordinary burglar and dismissed the incident, returning to the house. However, just a few minutes later, something unexpected occurred. The criminal headed to the neighboring house, where the beautiful Miss Kong lived, whose husband and children were away. She was suffering from insomnia and had not yet gone to sleep when the intruder burst into her home. Kang screamed, but realizing she was alone, the assailant attacked her, trying to stab her in the neck. Kang managed to dodge, but the blade grazed her face. Despite her severe injury, she gathered all her strength to fight back and attempted to wrest the knife from the attacker, engaging him in a struggle. As Miss Kang began to scream for help, neighbor Wang heard her cries and rushed to assist, armed with a wooden stick and gardening tools. The perpetrator, realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, fled, leaving his knife behind. Kong managed to survive, although she sustained serious injuries. She lost sight in one eye and her face was disfigured by scars. However, she succeeded in saving her life and, most importantly, managed to take the weapon away from the criminal. It turned out that the knife was made from a large saw blade, modified for cutting. Such tools are commonly used in logging operations around Yuan. Importantly, the handle of the knife had clear fingerprints of the perpetrator, which became a key piece of evidence. The Yuan police immediately checked the fingerprints against their database of offenders, but no matches were found. This suggested that the perpetrator was either not a resident of Yuan or had never come to the attention of the police before. Meanwhile, 3 days after this attack, on June 24th, at 1 o'clock in the morning, another crime occurred in the village of Xinbin. After a hard day's work, the Yang couple went to bed early, unaware that the criminal would break into their home. The perpetrator once again displayed his brutality when he burst into the Yang family's house. After killing the husband, he attacked his wife, inflicting horrific injuries. He sliced open her abdomen and severed her breast. These atrocities shocked the residents of the Qingbin area, and the police immediately launched an investigation. However, the criminal disappeared again, and his actions ceased for an entire year. Upon learning of the incidents in Qingbin, the Yuan police concluded that this maniac was operating not only in their area, but also in other regions. The police forces from Liaoning and Jilin provinces joined efforts, and by analyzing crime scenes and similar patterns, determined that all these attacks were the work of a single individual. A large-scale operation to capture the criminal was organized in Yuan and Jilin, forcing him to halt his assaults and relocate to another area. However, just a month later, another murder occurred in Xinbin. In a short period, 4 people lost their lives, and 1 more sustained serious injuries. Several women were brutally mutilated. Their breasts were slashed with a knife. The police of Liaoning and Jilin formed a special task force for the investigation, but the perpetrator, as if sensing danger, once again went into hiding, committing no attacks over the next 6 months. During these 6 months, the police of Yuan and Xinbin conducted extensive investigations in their regions, but no results were forthcoming. Investigators concluded that the perpetrator was likely from Yuan or Xinbin, as his actions had been concentrated in those areas. The emergence of the criminal's fingerprints instilled hope that he could be apprehended. However, despite 6 months of investigations, the police were unable to achieve significant results, and it seemed that the killer had completely vanished. But suddenly, after half a year of silence, this demon of murder reappeared. The perpetrator resumed his attacks in the border area between Xinbin and Yuan, in the region of Maicacao. On the night of May 31, 1919, around 10 o'clock in the evening, he broke into the home of a young couple in the village of Ailinzong. Both spouses were brutally murdered. Their throats were slit, and the chest of the wife, Mrs. Song, was mutilated. Just a few hours later, at dawn on June 1st, the criminal committed another attack on the Yu family home. He slipped inside and fatally wounded the wife of the house, stabbing her in the carotid artery. The woman, bleeding profusely, tried to wake her husband, who was sleeping in another room. When he woke up, he saw his wife on the floor, bleeding out. In despair, Yu attempted to fight the attacker, but the criminal, realizing he was at a disadvantage, stabbed him in the arm before fleeing. The perpetrator, having committed yet another attack, fled the crime scene. However, his actions continued. 2 months later, on August 13th, around 11 o'clock at night, he broke into the home of the Ney family in the Maicacao area. This time, his target was the homeowner, Mr. Ney, whom he fatally stabbed on the spot. Mrs. Wu, Mr. Ney's wife, was sleeping in another room when the killer attacked her husband. Awakening to the noise, she ran outside in horror, screaming for help, but the criminal caught up with her in the garden and coldly slashed her throat. When the police arrived at the crime scene, they found fingerprints mixed with blood on the back door of the house. Comparing them with fingerprints collected from previous investigations, the police confirmed that this was the same criminal whose traces had been found in June of the previous year. This confirmed the suspicion that the maniac had been killing in Yuan, Xinbin, and Maicacao for 3 years. During this time, he had taken the lives of 12 people and injured 17. His victims were primarily women, whom he not only killed but also brutally dismembered, slicing open their abdomens, cutting off their breasts, and inflicting injuries to their genitals. What was most striking was that all 3 regions where the murders occurred were in close proximity to each other. The perpetrator most likely resided in one of these areas, yet despite his monstrous crimes and the obvious evidence, the local police, due to a lack of resources and experience, were unable to apprehend him. The police, having shown a lack of responsibility, collected only 2 fingerprints, which caused significant discontent among higher law enforcement authorities. The provincial police decided to take control of the case. For 4 years, residents of these 3 regions lived in constant fear. This was particularly true for women, who did not feel safe even at night while sleeping next to their husbands. A whole year passed, and by August 2000, the case had still not made any progress. Then, on the morning of August 24, 2000, an event occurred that would change the course of the investigation. A woman named Ma, living in the village of Beisiping in Qingbin, was washing in a river near her field. She was wearing only her underwear, a bra and panties. At that time, her husband was working nearby. Ma was a strong and sturdy woman, tall and hefty, possessing such physical power that an ordinary man would have difficulty confronting her. Suddenly, she heard someone stepping on a branch in the woods and felt that someone was watching her. She quickly got out of the water and loudly called, "Who's there? Come out!" as she tried to locate the intruder. Just as she finished speaking, a man jumped out of the woods, holding a knife in both hands. Realizing she was in danger, Ma began to shout for help, calling for her husband to come quickly. Ma shouted for help as the attacker took a few steps closer, knife ready to strike. However, Ma, not hesitating, grabbed a sickle lying on the ground and swung it at the assailant, aiming for his head. The attacker, caught off guard by such decisive resistance, stumbled backward. Ma did not stop and attempted to pin him to the ground, aiming for his neck, but the attacker managed to retreat a step. He got back up and attempted to stab Ma with the knife, but at that moment, her husband, armed with a hoe, rushed in to help and struck the assailant on the head. Realizing that the situation was turning against him, the attacker quickly jumped onto his motorcycle and fled. Ma and her husband were unable to catch him and immediately reported the incident to the police. When the police arrived at the scene, it became clear that they had encountered the same brutal killer. This time, the perpetrator made a mistake by choosing to attack during the day, allowing Ma to remember his appearance. According to Ma and her husband, his face was so unusual and ugly that it was impossible to forget. Ma and her husband were able to recall the assailant's description accurately. They stated that he was no taller than 150 centimeters and fled on a red motorcycle. The emergence of witnesses became a crucial turning point in the investigation. The police promptly requested the creation of a composite sketch and enlisted the help of renowned specialists. With the fingerprints and the composite sketch, they were able to make an important inference. The perpetrator might have worked in the logging industry around Yuan. One of the local logging camps confirmed that the suspect could be Yang Hunjun, based on the description from the composite sketch. Yang, a 38-year-old man, had worked in the forestry industry for over 20 years and was originally from Yuan. He was known for his strange, elongated face with asymmetrical features, making him unforgettable after just one glance. The police immediately launched an investigation. Soon they discovered his red motorcycle. Although Yan had no criminal history, there were rumors about him being a man who often found himself in awkward situations and received scoldings from his wife in public. He did not fit the profile of a typical violent criminal. However, the police checked his fingerprints on an old loan document and found a complete match with the prints collected at the crime scenes. Several days prior, Yan Hungjun realized that the police were investigating him. Displaying cunning, he went into hiding and, according to witness reports, rode deep into the forest on his motorcycle. In response, about 1,000 police officers and 10,000 volunteers were mobilized to begin extensive searches in the mountains. 4 days later, on January 11th, Yan Hungjun was apprehended in the woods. If the forest police or city department had taken responsibility for his search sooner and checked the fingerprints earlier, the criminal could have been caught much faster, and the number of victims might not have increased. This highlighted deficiencies in the investigation and the sluggishness of law enforcement. Why did Yan Hungjun commit such heinous crimes? He was born in 1964 into a poor family of lumberjacks in the village of Sanxiang, Yuan. From childhood, his life was difficult. He had a condition that made his face asymmetrical and his body painfully thin. Due to his appearance, he was always an outcast, unable to make friends, and mostly spent his time isolating himself with relatives or simply avoiding society. From an early age, signs of sexual deviations began to manifest in Yan. At the age of 13, Yan Hungjun's perverse tendencies began to emerge. He started to peek at women in restrooms. After a few months, he was caught by 2 men whose wives had become his objects of voyeurism. Furious, they publicly beat Yan and threatened to turn him into the police the next time they caught him. They then took him home, where his father, enraged by the shame, brutally beat him while hanging him by his arms. However, despite his fear of his father and the public humiliation, Yan's deviant tendencies did not disappear. When he was 14, his father sustained a serious injury in the logging industry and could no longer work. Despite only having completed the 5th grade, Yan was forced to take over for his father and start working in logging. His colleagues noted that, despite his young age, he was intelligent and hardworking. In 1986, at the age of 22, Yan married the daughter of a colleague. For some time, his life followed a fairly normal path. He had a son, and the family lived in relative peace and harmony. However, a few years later, Yan began to lose interest in his wife, and their marriage became a burden for him. Yan regarded his wife as decent but too stubborn and slow. Additionally, he found her to be harmless and uninteresting. In search of pleasure, he began to watch adult videos, which were rare at the time. However, this was not enough, and he started visiting prostitutes. Since 1994, Yan regularly used their services, losing interest in his job in logging. Instead, he opened a small restaurant and bought himself a motorcycle. In the 1990s, owning a motorcycle was uncommon, and Yan primarily bought it to make it easier to meet women. However, his appearance did not attract women. They showed no interest in him, so Yan was forced to seek connections through prostitution. Over 15 years, he spent a lot of money on these encounters, but twice his wife caught him with prostitutes. After that, Yan could no longer have contact with those women, which fueled his rage. He felt that he had wasted a lot of money and harbored resentment towards women, blaming them for deceiving him. This fostered a growing hatred for women within him. One day at the Maikaku railway station, Yan Hongjun arranged to meet an attractive prostitute, agreeing on a price of 30 yuan. They entered a hotel room, and as soon as the woman began to undress, two men with knives burst in. They accused Yan of attempting to rape the woman and demanded money, threatening to kill him if he did not pay. Yan realized he had fallen into a trap but felt powerless to do anything. The prostitute and her accomplices mocked him, calling him a freak who didn't deserve women's attention. Yan lost about 100 yuan, nearly a third of his monthly salary, and then, to avoid pursuit, was forced to give them even his clothes. He spent the rest of the night walking home in his underwear and trousers, feeling humiliated and insulted. This incident ignited a deep-seated hatred for women within him. Things worsened a month later when Yan began experiencing urinary issues. When he went to the hospital, he discovered he had contracted a sexually transmitted disease. By the end of 1995, Yan also learned that his wife was cheating on him with a younger man. This only intensified his disdain for women, adding even more bitterness and rage to his heart. By the 27th, Yan Hongjun's illness was partially treated, and that night he decided to meet with a prostitute again. His goal was to pass his disease on to her as an act of revenge. However, when the woman learned of his intention, she laughed at him and taunted him, saying that because of his illness, he wouldn't be able to do anything. This only fueled his anger and hatred. Yan was convinced that all his suffering was the result of women's cruelty, and that he needed to take revenge, especially against young and beautiful women. The illness and emotional scars accumulated over the years fueled an unbearable hatred and a desire for revenge in him. Women became his targets, especially those who were young and beautiful. When Yan was finally arrested, he told the police, "Thank you for catching me. I could no longer control myself and didn't know what else I could do. If this continued, I might have even killed my mother." Yan confessed that during his last attack on a woman bathing in the river, he could no longer suppress his urges. Each time he killed, cutting open the abdomen and severing the breasts and genitals of his victims, their screams of terror brought him indescribable pleasure. In court, he stated that he hated beautiful women and couldn't understand why God had granted them such beauty. Yan Hongjun, a victim of his twisted thoughts, ultimately began to question, why did God endow women with such beauty and attractiveness? This obsession led him to an even greater hatred of women and transformed into a desire for revenge. Gradually, he became a sexual murderer, using increasingly brutal methods to satisfy his perverse desires. He turned into a monstrous maniac whose actions were utterly incomprehensible to human understanding. Yan, accused of multiple murders and sexual crimes, was captured and brought to trial on April 18, 2000. This demon in human form received a severe sentence, and many hoped that such crimes would never happen again.